Hey YouTube, I've seen a lot of videos on the is-ought gap, and at first I blew them off. Originally I found this concept to be pretty difficult to comprehend and even harder to explain, but since then I've changed my mind completely and now I find it really interesting. So here's the claim. You cannot derive an ought from an is. That means I cannot derive what ought to be the case merely from what is the case. So consider this example. This is a pen. But just pointing out that this is a pen doesn't tell me what I ought to do with it. It doesn't tell me whether I ought write with it, or I ought stab someone with it, or I ought click it in a really annoying fashion. In fact, I'm not obligated to do anything with it. Now, originally, I thought this concept was flawed, because if you have a goal, you can bridge the is-ought gap. For example, pointing out that the wood stove is hot tells me that I ought not touch the wood stove if it is my goal to avoid getting burned. But that's not a problem with the view. That just means that you cannot derive an ought from an is unless you have a goal. Alright, so before I make this argument, I just want to point out a couple people who were influential in helping me develop my view, even though most of them did so without knowing about it. So this ranges from theists who are arguing similar points to what I'm going to be presenting, and atheists who just brought up really good questions and got me thinking. So the theists include VBFL 920, jrsbarker, and veritas48, and the atheists include ProfMTH, Tooltime 9901, Gothatfunk, and Fauyd. So feel free to check out their channels. I'll link to them in the more info section. They all produce thought-provoking videos. So let's define some terms. A subjective goal or purpose is a goal or purpose which you assign to yourself. And an objective goal or purpose is a goal which you have but you did not assign to yourself. And an obligatory ought. This is the way we are obligated to act. It means we should act in accordance with an objective goal or proper functioning. Now, the only way to get an ought from an is to have a goal. If we are designed by God, that means we are created with a goal and that we have an objective ought. For example, scissors are designed. By saying you designed a pair of scissors, that means that you created them with the goal of cutting paper. If it is designed to have proper functioning. Now, because the scissors are created with a goal, there is a way they ought to function. Because the scissors have a proper function, I could assign a subjective goal to the scissors which could possibly create improper functioning. So because they are designed, there is a way they should act and possibly a way they shouldn't act. So let's compare this to something which isn't designed, and let's say that a rock isn't designed. Now, a rock is not designed with a purpose. Therefore, it has no goal or intended behavior. There is no improper functioning of a rock. Now, merely observing that there is a rock doesn't tell me what I ought to do with it. I don't know whether I ought to throw it or use it as a paperweight. There is no proper way to use it. However, I can assign a subjective goal to it and use it however I want. Now, there's no way I ought to use it, so however I choose to use it is fine. Now, evolution and natural selection are not a designer. It is much more like the rock example than the scissors. At best, evolution could create a rock which happens to look like scissors. The rock may be capable of cutting like scissors, but it would still not have or not be created with an objective goal. However, it could have the illusion of a goal. Now, I'll make another video specifically explaining why evolution cannot be a designer. So, to the argument. I think we can all agree with premise 1. Premise 1 is, without a goal, we cannot derive an ought from an is. Premise 2. If we are designed by God, we are created with a purpose, and there is a way we ought to function because we are created with a goal. Therefore, we have an objective ought, and this is supported by the scissors analogy. Premise 3. If we are not designed, we exist without an objective goal, and this is supported by the rock analogy. Premise 4. Now, given premise 3, it follows that there would be no obligatory ought. We would have no purpose other than the arbitrary one we assign to ourselves, making our oughts subjective. All oughts would be derived through subjective value judgments. Now, as Gothatfunk put it, and he's atheist here on YouTube, his subjective goal is to make people smile. So in his case, he ought to be kind. However, I could just as easily have a subjective goal to make people frown. In that case, I ought to be a jerk. Premise 5. If all your goals are based off what you personally value, by definition they are a preference. Now, no preference can be wrong or better than anyone else's preference. For example, if I prefer chocolate ice cream and you prefer vanilla, that does not make you wrong. There are no wrong preferences to have. Now, to clarify, there are better ways of achieving goals, but no goal is better than another. See, if my goal is to get from point A to point B as fast as possible, then I should or ought to run rather than walk. But the goal to make people smile would be no better or worse than the goal to make people frown. Alright, premise 6. Whether or not it coincides with your goals, killing an innocent man solely for fun is wrong. Premise 7. If premise 6 is true, we have an objective goal. If it is a belief we ought to hold regardless of our subjective goals, it is an obligatory ought. Premise 8. We have innate knowledge based on the veracity of or truth of our moral experience that allows us to conclude that premise 6 is true. What that's basically saying is, evolution has hardwired a moral sense into our being, and it is self-evident that torturing innocent people solely for fun is both wrong and improper behavior. Premise 9. It is more rational to conclude that our moral experience, like our sensory experience, is true in the absence of a defeater. Basically, it is not rational to think that our moral sense is an illusion. Therefore, objective oughts exist, and atheism cannot account for them, making theism a better explanation of reality. So remember, God loves you, and so do I.